On a summer night in 1976, Sacramento, California. 51 rapes, 13 murders, one man. He wore a badge. 40 years later, a single tissue pulled from a trash can matched DNA from a crime scene no one had forgotten. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly how something that small ended a manhunt that spanned 4 decades. It starts on a Tuesday in June. Rancho Cordova, a quiet suburb east of Sacramento. A woman wakes in the dark. There is a flashlight in her face. Behind it, a figure in a ski mask. He holds a knife. He tells her if she moves, he will kill her. She does not move. The house shows no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no kicked-in door. The locks are intact, but a side window, the one facing the backyard, is unlatched. Investigators find it slightly open. Someone had been here before. Someone had walked through this house when it was empty, checked the layout, unlocked that window, and left. Then came back. On the bed, a set of shoelaces, not hers. They had been placed there ahead of time, staged, ready to be used as ligatures. In the kitchen, a towel torn into strips, blindfold material, also prepared in advance. Nothing about this is impulsive. Everything has been arranged. Outside, the backyard opens onto a creek bed that runs behind a row of houses. No fences. A clear path in and out, invisible from the street. Whoever did this knew the neighborhood, the access points, the blind spots, the places where no one looks. Forensics collects what little evidence exists. No fingerprints. The attacker wore gloves. No footprints clear enough to cast. But there is biological evidence. Samples are taken, sealed, and sent to the crime lab. In 1976, DNA profiling does not exist. The samples are cataloged, boxed, and stored in a refrigerated evidence locker. A standard procedure. Routine. The kind of thing that sits on a shelf for years and never gets looked at again. Across the street, in the stillness of early morning, a neighbor notices a patrol car parked outside the house. He watches from his window for a moment, then he goes back to bed. It is, after all, just another Tuesday in the suburbs. No one on that block knows it yet, but this is only the beginning. Within 6 months, the attacker struck at least 10 more times across Sacramento's east side: Carmichael, Citrus Heights, Rancho Cordova. The method was always the same. No forced entry, a window unlocked days in advance. Shoelaces staged inside the home, a ski mask, a knife or a gun, a flashlight in the face of a sleeping woman. He had been inside their homes before they even knew he existed. In October 1976, a young woman named Jane Carson Sandler became his 5th victim. Her husband had just left for work. Her 3-year-old son had crawled into bed beside her. Within minutes, a man in a ski mask and black leather gloves burst down the hallway holding a butcher knife. Jane told him to take whatever he wanted. He said, in clenched teeth, "Shut up, or I will kill you." He tied her wrists and ankles with shoelaces. He gagged and blindfolded her. Then he blindfolded her son. When the attacker untied her ankles, Jane leaned toward her boy. He was gone. During the assault, all she could think about was where her son was. At one point, she leaned again. He was back beside her. She did not know how or when he had been moved. But he was alive. That was enough to keep her from breaking apart. The attacker spent what felt like hours inside the house. Jane could hear him in the kitchen, rattling pots, opening drawers, eating. Then he would return. "Don't you make a move," he said, "or I'll come back in here and kill you." Finally, there was silence. Jane hobbled with bound ankles through the backyard, reached the front gate, and screamed for a neighbor. She survived, but the life her family had known did not. By mid-1977, investigators had a pattern, but no face, no name, and no fingerprints. The attacker was meticulous. He wore gloves. He planned entries days in advance. He knew the layouts of the neighborhoods, the creek beds, the open spaces behind fences, the schools that provided cover after dark. He moved like someone who had studied the area on foot, many times, before ever stepping inside a house. Then, something changed. A local newspaper reported that the attacker had never targeted a home where a man was present. It was meant as reassurance. For the rapist, it was a challenge. Almost immediately, he began attacking couples. His method evolved. He would wake both victims with a flashlight, force the woman to tie up the man, then bind the woman himself. He would stack dishes or cups on the man's back and say, "If I hear these rattle, I will kill everyone in the house." The man would lie there, immobilized, listening, unable to move, unable to help. Then the attacker would take the woman to another room. Investigators in Sacramento were overwhelmed. The attacks were happening every few weeks, sometimes days apart. Entire neighborhoods installed deadbolts, families bought guns, parents kept children inside after dark. He had complete control over this community. In November 1977, the attacker broke into the home of 13-year-old Margaret Wardlow. Margaret woke to a flashlight in her face. She saw the ski mask. He tied her hands behind her back. Then he left her room. Margaret could hear him upstairs in the kitchen. She knew from newspaper accounts what he did. He placed dishes on the backs of family members he did not intend to target. An alarm system made of porcelain. If you moved, he would hear. She lay there and listened. If he came back to her room, he was going to rape her mother. If he went into her mother's room, he was going to rape her. He went into her room. Margaret made a decision. She would not let him see her afraid. She knew he fed on fear, that control was what he wanted more than anything, so she gave him nothing. She was 13 years old, and according to investigators, he thrived on it. In 1977, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department held a series of town hall meetings. Residents packed the rooms. At one meeting, a man stood up and declared that if the rapist ever came to his house, he would kill him. He said he would protect his wife, protect his family. The room applauded. Just months later, that man and his wife were attacked in their home. The rapist had almost certainly been sitting in that room, disguised as just another concerned citizen. Think about what investigators were dealing with at this point. An attacker who pre-entered homes, who adjusted his methods based on what he read in the press, who sat in a town hall meeting and listened to the man he would later attack. This was not impulsive. This was someone who studied, adapted, and controlled every variable. Someone trained to think that way. After each attack, something else unsettled investigators. The victims' phones would ring, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. When they answered, silence, or heavy breathing, or a whispered threat. Investigators managed to record one of those calls. The voice was guttural, almost inhuman. He was taunting them. He wanted them to know he was still there. Before we get to what happened next, if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe, because what came next, no one saw coming. By 1979, the attacks in Northern California stopped. 51 women and girls had been assaulted across Sacramento and surrounding counties. Thousands of leads had been chased. Larry Crompton, an investigator with the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department, had personally gone through the names of 6,000 paroled rapists. Every promising lead collapsed. Every suspect was cleared. The East Area Rapist, the name the press had given him, vanished. But Larry Crompton had a feeling the silence did not mean it was over. In December 1979, more than 200 miles south, a couple was found murdered in their home in Goleta, near Santa Barbara. Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Deborah Manning, had been bound and beaten. In March 1980, Lyman and Charlene Smith were found dead in Ventura. 5 months later, Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point. In February 1981, Manuela Whithune in Irvine. In July 1981, Sherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez in Santa Barbara County. 5 crime scenes, 10 victims, all couples or women alone, all bound, all in their homes. The method was almost identical to the Sacramento rapes, except now the attacker was leaving no one alive. Crompton saw the pattern immediately. The bindings were the same. The method of entry was the same. The way the victims were separated, the same. He told investigators in Southern California that their murders were connected to the rapes up north. They were the same man. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, law enforcement agencies across California did not share information easily. Different counties, different jurisdictions, different case files that never touched. Crompton could not convince them. Debbie Domingo was 15 when her mother Sherry was murdered alongside her boyfriend Greg Sanchez in Santa Barbara County. Debbie and her mother had been fighting for weeks, the kind of fighting that happens between a headstrong teenager and a mother trying to hold the line. Debbie had run away from home. She had been gone about 3 weeks when a neighbor called. "You need to come home." No one told her what had really happened. The best answer she ever got was someone broke into the house and killed them. The last thing Debbie had said to her mother was, "Why don't you just stay out of my life?" She carried those words for nearly 40 years. The killer struck one more time. In May 1986, in Irvine, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was found in her home. She had been bludgeoned. She was the youngest murder victim, and the last. After Janelle Cruz, the attacker disappeared. Not for months, not for years, for decades. Think about what investigators had at this point. Over 50 rapes in Northern California, at least 13 murders across Southern California, a consistent method spanning 10 years and 15 jurisdictions, and not a single name, not a single suspect who held up under scrutiny. The largest crime spree by a single offender in California history, and it had gone completely cold. Then, in 1996, something shifted. DNA technology, which had not existed when the crimes were committed, had advanced enough to test old evidence. Investigators in Orange County pulled the stored biological samples from the Janelle Cruz case and ran them. The DNA matched samples from the Manuela Withoon case 5 years earlier. Then hits came from Ventura County, Santa Barbara County. One by one, the Southern California murders linked together through a single genetic profile. But the most important connection came in 2001. Investigator Paul Holes, working cold cases for the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, tested the Northern California rape kits, the ones that had been sealed and stored in evidence lockers since the 1970s. The same lockers, the same routine procedure from 25 years earlier. The DNA from the rapes matched the DNA from the murders. It was official. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, two names that had haunted two different halves of California for 2 different decades, were the same person. One man, over 50 rapes, 13 murders, a trail that stretched from Sacramento to Irvine across 10 years. And now, for the first time, investigators had his genetic fingerprint. They ran it against California's criminal DNA database, the 3rd largest in the world. Every convicted felon, every person arrested for a felony in the state. Millions of profiles. The result came back empty. No match. He was not in the system. Whoever this man was, he had never been convicted of a felony in California. He had never been arrested on charges that required a DNA sample. For all the destruction he had caused, he did not exist in any law enforcement database on Earth. The case went cold again. Years passed. Investigators retired. Witnesses aged. Leads dried up. Larry Crompton, the detective who had seen the connection decades earlier, watched the case stall from the outside. Paul Holes kept working it. But there was nowhere left to look. The DNA was the key, and the key fit no known lock. In 2013, a true crime writer named Michelle McNamara published a feature article in Los Angeles Magazine about the case. McNamara had spent years on online message boards, connecting with fellow amateur investigators, pulling fragments of information from old case files and retired detectives who trusted her. She had flown to Sacramento to walk the crime scenes with Paul Holes. She had driven the neighborhoods at night, retracing the routes the attacker would have used. The case consumed her. McNamara felt the attacker's various names, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, were too obscure for the public to recognize. Working with her editor, she coined a new name, the Golden State Killer. It showed the full breadth of what he had done, north to south, across the entire state. She signed a book deal to tell the full story. On the night of April 20th, 2016, Michelle was exhausted. Her husband, the comedian Patton Oswalt, told her to sleep in the next morning. By mid-morning, he checked on her. She was snoring. He left an Americano on her bedside table. By early afternoon, she still had not gotten up. He went back to check. Michelle McNamara was dead. She was 46 years old. The coroner later found that a combination of prescription medications and an undiagnosed heart condition had killed her in her sleep. Her book was unfinished, but Patton Oswalt made a decision. It had consumed her life. It was part of her. The book needed to be completed. In February 2018, with the help of researcher Paul Haynes and journalist Billy Jensen, I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published. It reignited national attention on the case. It put the name Golden State Killer into the public consciousness for good. 2 months later, the case broke open. Paul Holes was approaching retirement. He had spent over 20 years on the Golden State Killer case. The DNA profile from the crime scenes had been run against every law enforcement database available, and returned nothing. But Holes had been watching a new field emerge: forensic genetic genealogy. The idea was radical. Instead of searching criminal databases for the killer's DNA, search consumer genealogy databases, the websites where ordinary people upload their genetic profiles to trace their ancestry and find relatives. In early 2018, Holes and an FBI team uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GED Match, a free, open-source genealogy platform used by millions of people to find distant relatives. They were not looking for the killer himself. They were looking for anyone who shared enough DNA to be a relative. The results came back. Distant matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor generations back. It was not a name. It was the beginning of a family tree. A civilian genealogy expert named Barbara Ray Venter began building that tree, branch by branch, generation by generation, working backward through public records, census data, and birth certificates. The distant matches narrowed, the branches converged. Within weeks, investigators had a pool of 6 men who fit the profile: the right age, the right geographic history, the right physical characteristics. Only one of those 6 men had blue eyes that matched the witness descriptions from 40 years earlier. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old. He lived in Citrus Heights, California, the same suburb where he had attacked women in the 1970s. He had lived there for nearly 4 decades. He was a retired truck mechanic, a grandfather. He had 3 adult daughters. His ex-wife was a divorce attorney. He had no criminal record that would have placed his DNA in any database. But there was one detail in his background that changed everything. From 1973 to 1976, Joseph DeAngelo had served as a police officer in Exeter, California, working the burglary unit. From 1976 to 1979, he was a police officer in Auburn. He was a cop, the man who had terrorized an entire state, who had pre-entered homes, studied neighborhoods, evaded every dragnet, adjusted his methods based on press coverage, and sat in a town hall meeting listening to the man he would later attack, had been trained in law enforcement. He knew how investigations worked. He knew how evidence was collected. He knew what to avoid. In 1979, DeAngelo was caught shoplifting from a store. The items he stole were a hammer and a can of dog repellent, tools consistent with a burglar who bludgeoned victims and silenced guard dogs. He was fired from the Auburn police force. But DeAngelo's crimes had started even before the rapes. Between 1974 and 1975, While he was still a police officer in Exeter, a burglar terrorized the nearby city of Visalia. Over 120 break-ins in 20 months. The press called him the Visalia ransacker. He stole small things, coins, stamps, single earrings. He scattered women's clothing. He left windows unlocked for later use. In September 1975, he tried to kidnap a 16-year-old girl from her home. Her father, a college professor named Claude Snelling, confronted the masked intruder in the carport. The intruder shot him twice. Snelling died. The Visalia ransacker was never caught. 43 years later, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to that murder too. There was something else. Before D'Angelo married his wife Sharon in 1973, he had been engaged to another woman, a nursing student named Bonnie Jean Colwell. They had met at Sierra College. The relationship turned controlling, then abusive. When Bonnie ended it in 1971, D'Angelo threatened her with a gun and tried to force her to marry him. She refused. She left. He never got over it. During one of the rapes in 1978, the 37th attack, investigators later reported that D'Angelo said the same phrase over and over again while assaulting the victim. "I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you, Bonnie." He was not speaking to the woman in front of him. He was speaking to someone who had left him 7 years earlier. Every attack, every victim, filtered through a rage he had carried since a woman told him no and walked away. After that, he disappeared from law enforcement entirely. But the crimes did not stop. They escalated. From rape to murder. From Sacramento to Southern California. Until 1986, when Janelle Cruz became his final victim. And then, silence. 32 years of it. Investigators now had a name. They had a family tree that pointed to D'Angelo. They had a geographic and biographical profile that fit, but they did not yet have proof. GEDmatch had given them relatives, not D'Angelo himself. To make an arrest, they needed his DNA, directly from him. For 10 days, surveillance teams watched D'Angelo's house in Citrus Heights. He was 72. He lived with a daughter and granddaughter. He mowed his lawn. He took out his trash. He went about the quiet routines of a retired man in the suburbs. Investigators needed something he had touched, discarded, left behind. Something that carried his DNA and had been abandoned in public, where no warrant was required. They enlisted the help of a garbage truck driver on D'Angelo's route. On collection day, the driver pulled the trash from D'Angelo's curb. Inside, investigators found a tissue. They sent it to the lab. The DNA on that tissue matched the DNA from the crime scenes. 40 years, 51 rapes, 13 murders, 15 jurisdictions. The largest criminal DNA database in the state had returned nothing. A genealogy website built for family reunions had returned a family tree, and a tissue pulled from a suburban trash can had returned the answer. On April 24, 2018, almost exactly 2 years after Michelle McNamara died in her sleep, officers arrived at the house on Canyon Oak Drive in Citrus Heights. Joseph James D'Angelo was standing in his front yard. He was arrested without incident. When investigators told him why they were there, according to published reports, he muttered a single phrase: "I have a roast in the oven." The phone call started within minutes. Jane Carson Sandler, the woman whose 3-year-old son had disappeared from the bed beside her during the attack in 1976, received a call from Debbie Domingo, the daughter of Sherry Domingo, who had been murdered in Santa Barbara in 1981. Debbie was the first voice to tell her. They got him. Margaret Wardlow, the girl who had been 13 years old when she was attacked, who had refused to show the rapist she was afraid, said she couldn't wipe the smile off her face. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James D'Angelo appeared in a Sacramento courtroom. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. As part of a plea deal that took the death penalty off the table, he also admitted to more than 160 uncharged crimes, including dozens of rapes. The statute of limitations on those rapes had long expired. He could never be formally charged for them. But in that courtroom, he said the word, admit, one by one, case by case. For days, victims and their families stood before him and spoke. D'Angelo sat in a wheelchair, stone-faced, never once looking in their direction. Jane Carson Sandler addressed him directly. "I may have been one of your victims," she said, "but now I'm a survivor and a thriver. I finished my nursing degree the same year of your attack. I spent 30 years in the Air Force. I achieved the rank of colonel." Debbie Domingo told him if she had her way, he would be shivering, blindfolded, naked, and exposed for the rest of his life. She said she would settle for caged and shackled. Patricia Cosper, whose mother had been raped when Patricia was 7 years old, made a point of thanking someone who was not in the room, Michelle McNamara. "She didn't give up," Patricia said, "and law enforcement did not give up. I see her as a survivor, because she got him caught. Her spirit survived." When every victim had spoken, D'Angelo rose from his wheelchair. The man who had sat motionless for days stood up on his own legs and spoke. "I've listened to all your statements," he said, "each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone." On August 21, 2020, a judge sentenced Joseph James D'Angelo to 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 8 additional years. He will die in prison. He has never explained why he did what he did. He has never spoken publicly beyond those 11 words. Debbie Domingo was 15 when her mother Sherry was murdered in 1981. The last thing Debbie had said to her mother was, "Why don't you just stay out of my life?" They had been fighting, the way a headstrong teenager fights with a mother trying to lay down rules. Debbie had run away from home. She had been gone 3 weeks when a neighbor called and told her to come home. For nearly 40 years, Debbie carried the weight of those last words. At the sentencing hearing, she stood in front of D'Angelo and spoke directly to the man who had taken away any chance of saying something different. She told him she would settle for him being caged, shackled, and humiliated for the rest of his life. Then she sat down. The last words she said to her mother never changed. But the silence that followed them, the silence that had lasted 39 years, was finally over in the courtroom. The tissue that ended everything, the one pulled from a trash can on a suburban curb in Citrus Heights, had been discarded like it was nothing. And for 40 years, the evidence that would eventually convict him had sat in a refrigerated locker, sealed in a box, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. Both pieces were ordinary. Both were routine, and both were the reason a man who had hidden behind a badge, behind a mask, behind 32 years of silence, is now behind bars for the rest of his life. Michelle McNamara's book was published in February 2018. She had written a line near the end, addressed directly to the killer she had spent years hunting. She wrote, "I know you're out there. I'm coming for you." 2 months after those words reached the public, investigators knocked on D'Angelo's door. She never knew his name, but she had given him the one the world would remember. The Golden State Killer case changed the way cold cases are investigated across America. Since D'Angelo's arrest, more than 150 violent crime suspects have been identified using genetic genealogy. If you'd been one of the investigators who spent decades chasing this man, and then watched a genealogy website and a tissue in a trash can do what 40 years of police work could not, what would you feel? Relief? Frustration? Both? Tell me in the comments. There is another case, another killer who hid for decades, another family that waited a lifetime for answers, and the detail that broke it was even smaller than a tissue in a trash can.